This video is going to be pretty different, because this time I have a guest joining me. For the first time on my channel, I'm joined by my brother, Dr. Andrew Ridden-Harper, who was of course the first doctor in my family and the one whose footsteps I seem to be following in. He's always been behind the scenes helping me out with this channel, helping me bounce ideas off of him and checking out if what I'm saying is correct, or if how I'm making thumbnails is good, and all this kind of stuff. So he's been extremely helpful in that capacity and also in motivating me to continue making videos. So it's great to have him join me on the channel this time, and we're going to be talking about some of the oldest science fiction. So this is going to be the start of a new series where every now and then we'll dive into some really old science fiction and see how it compares to what we know today, and if there's any interesting insights we can get into the cultures where the people that wrote those stories were embedded. So I hope you like this new kind of video. If you do, let me know in the comments, and I hope you enjoy it. In this video, I'm joined by a very special guest, the original Dr. Ridden-Harper, my brother Andrew Ridden-Harper, who's a postdoc at Cornell University and works mostly on exoplanets. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Exoplanets are like normal planets, except they are outside of the solar system, which means they orbit distant stars. And in particular, what I do is try to figure out what makes up their atmospheres by using very large telescopes and complicated data analysis. So this kind of work can help us to better understand how they formed and evolved, and even give us hints about the possibilities of alien life in the universe.
Yeah, it's certainly a really cool topic to research, and I'm sure many astronomers, or a lot of people in the general public as well, the holy grail of astronomy research would be finding evidence of alien life, finding out that we're indeed not alone in the universe. So it's pretty cool that you're actually working on that problem in some capacity. But another thing aliens play into a lot is science fiction. And we're both massive fans of science fiction. We've, of course, watched all of the Star Trek series. I've cleared rooms a few times by talking about Star Trek, so I've got a reputation there. But we haven't really, either of us, gone back into the history of science fiction and really seen how the ideas have progressed and evolved over time and how they relate to what we know now. So we thought it could be fun to do a video series where we go back and read through the very earliest science fictions. And we're going to be going very far back today. I think much further back than certainly myself or Andrew. Have you gone this far back before?
I have not. I don't even think Doctor Who has gone back this far before.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think you did interact with some Romans at some point, but not so sure about the ancient Greeks. So we're going right back to what some call the first science fiction. It was published in the 2nd century AD, which is about 1,870 years ago, so incredibly long ago. And the story is called True Story, and it's written by Lucian of Samosata. And this true story has a few different components to it, but the component that we're going to be focusing on is the one relating to space, because that's generally where science fiction takes place. So the story is kind of a weird one, and there will be some things that we talk about that probably won't make much sense unless you've either read or listened to the story yourself. So if you want to read the true story, you can find it as an ebook on Project Gutenberg. I've left a link to that in the description. But there's also a fantastic audiobook by the YouTube channel called Sci-Fi Hub. I really recommend listening to this because it makes the old Greek story a bit more palatable to get through. And I've left a link to that one in the description as well. But before we get into talking about, I guess, the details of this story, Andrew, do you want to give us a brief synopsis of what actually happens?
So it's about some ancient Greek explorers that set out in their ship to explore the world. But while they're out in the sea, they get caught up in a giant whirlpool which sucks them way up into the sky and eventually all the way to the moon. And when they get to the moon, they find that it's actually inhabited, and that the inhabitants of the moon are at war with the inhabitants of the sun, which is also inhabited. A battle ensues, and they encounter lots of interesting creatures and people. And so the story is really a recounting of their strange experiences.
And there certainly is a lot of strange stuff that happens in this story. And what's kind of interesting to me is that before the story even starts, Lucian prefaces the entire book with a pretty blunt statement. He says, "In this book, there are things I have neither seen nor experienced, nor heard tell from anybody else. Things, what is more, that do not in fact exist and could not ever exist at all. So my readers must not believe a word I say." And this is a very powerful statement, and it almost reads like it's this is the first work of fiction ever conceived and published. And I guess this could be kind of the case, because the many fantastical tales of ancient Greek culture where the gods interacted with humanity pretty frequently must have been hard to work out what was fiction from reality, or what was supposed reality. And Lucian had actually intended or seems to have intended this book to be a satirical take on those mythological tales. He said at one point that this is the most truthful mythological tale because it admits that it's all fabricated. All of it is just a big lie. So admitting it's a lie makes it more true than the tales written by Homer and other great Greek writers. So there are indeed many fantastical things that he writes about in this story that would be very hard to believe, even if he did not start with that disclaimer. As Andrew mentioned, our intrepid adventurers get lifted up into the sky by an enormous whirlwind. And this whirlwind lifts them by 3,000 stadia. Now, this isn't the Google Games platform, which is currently fighting for its life. This is a distance of measurement that the ancient Greeks used, where one stade equals 180 meters. So if you do the numbers, it's about 3,000 stadia is equal to 540 kilometers, which is a distance. But how does that distance match up with what we know of distances relative to space today, Andrew?
Yeah, it's interesting. The edge of space, which is where the Earth's atmosphere basically becomes negligible, it's called the Kármán line, is about 80 kilometers above the Earth's surface. So that's a lot lower than the 3,000 stadia that they were lifted to. Another thing that we can compare it to is the height of the International Space Station, which is actually about 4,000 kilometers. So this is pretty comparable to the 500 kilometers that they were lifted to.
Yeah, so it seems like the distance is actually okay. The random guess of Lucian that they were lifted by 3,000 stadia puts them in low Earth orbit. So that's all right. They're in space, but of course, to our explorers, space doesn't really seem to mean all too much. They can still breathe fine as if nothing had happened. But once they were in space, how did they move about? Where did they go?
Yeah, once they were there, they just drifted for 7 days and 7 nights. And all of this drifting eventually got them to the moon. And they landed on the moon. But interestingly, they found that it was cultivated and full of inhabitants, and that it had seas and woods and mountains and cities. So it was effectively just like the Earth.
That's pretty interesting that he had this idea that the moon was just another place like the Earth, even though I guess he wouldn't have actually been able to see any evidence of this from the ground. If you go outside and look at the moon at night, you certainly do not see evidence for forests and seas and that kind of thing. But in this case, he decides that that's the case. But one thing I do find quite fascinating is later on, he mentions that the adventurers look up into the sky and they see the Earth hanging above them, just like the moon does for us on Earth. So to them on the moon, the Earth looked just like the moon. And I thought that was a pretty amazing, I guess, leap of thinking, because this is about 1800 years before the Earthrise photo from Apollo 8. But he was still able to put himself in this mental position of being on the moon and looking around, and he made the deduction that you would see the Earth just as you would see the moon from the Earth. So I thought that was great. And another cool thing was that I guess the main motive or the main plot line behind this story is that the moon and the sun want to colonize various places around space. So there's not really a distinction, as far as Lucian makes, between the difference of the sun and moon and other stars and planets. They all just seem to be lands like the Earth that you could go to and find quite pleasant to live in. So this idea that you could actually leave the Earth, go to other places and settle them and make new colonies is, I think, pretty amazing as well. In many ways, it seems like space is just a continuation of the Earth, where if you leave the surface of the Earth, you just sail your way off to some other object and you'll find it as an island flying around in space. But since this is a Greek story, there's of course got to be lots of conflict happening. And there is a big battle between the forces of the sun and the moon, because they're both fighting over who gets to lay claim to Venus. And there's a lot of very interesting creatures. Do you want to take us through some of those creatures that take part in the battle between the Earth and Moon? Oh, sorry, the Sun and Moon.
Yeah, indeed, there are lots of very interesting creatures, and I guess it's fair to say that a lot of them are very similar to other kinds of creatures from ancient people's mythologies. For example, we have a lot of birds or winged creatures that can fly, because I guess he was imagining that space was just like the air, where he saw birds flying, so it would make sense for him that to do battle between the planets, you would need things that could fly. He, for example, imagined that there would be giant three-headed vultures that carried people on their backs, different kinds of birds that were made of like herbs and vegetables, some giant fleas people rode, and also some interesting, I guess, humanoid creatures that have large gowns that would catch the wind and allow them to fly, sort of like a sail of a ship. There are also giant spiders, and these are actually important to the story because the spiders actually make a web between Venus and the moon, I guess, that allows non-flying creatures to walk on and do battle with the other non-flying creatures.
An interesting point there is that there seems to be no concept of what gravity is. The spiders make these webs. Well, actually, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he did know what gravity was, and they could fight on the spider webs because they were sticking to them. That's actually a good point. Anyway, what other strange things are there?
Yeah, there were some other birds that resembled giant ants, and they had horns, I guess, like ant antennae, and they would clash their horns together. Some archers riding giant gnats, and some light infantry with slings that would sling poisonous radishes at the enemy. So I guess if you don't like radishes, you would think that's a good character. And interestingly, he mentioned that from Sirius, which is the constellation of the dog, there were men with dogs' heads, and so that they could battle in this aerial environment, they were riding on winged flying acorns.
Yeah, that one's quite strange. I don't know. Like, I guess birds with lettuce wings is pretty crazy. Poisonous radishes is also strange, but dog-head men riding flying acorns is pretty out there.
Yeah. And I guess the last main creature that we have came from the constellation of Sagittarius, which is a centaur. And these things are basically giant centaurs, half man and half horse, except the horse part also has wings so that they can fly.
The true multi-purpose Greek creature, that one. And then in the end, it's Sagittarius who ends up winning the battle for the Helios Empire over the moon. So the moon gets beaten quite badly, or actually in the beginning it looks like the moon's going to win. Then they get careless as they're dividing up all of the spoils of war, and then Sagittarius rolls on through and just cleans them out. So it didn't work out so well for the moon. So I guess there's some kind of lesson in there that you should always be vigilant and not assume you've won before it's really sorted. So after Sagittarius messes them up and takes a bunch of prisoners, the moon surrenders. And then what's quite interesting for me is that the Sun Empire builds a wall between the sun and moon to block all of the light from reaching the moon. So there's a few really interesting points in this, I guess. One point is that he recognizes that light comes from the sun and doesn't come from the moon. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, how does the orbital mechanics, or in their geocentric world, I wonder how that works with the wall in space. It must just kind of somehow rotate around the moon. I'm really impressed by this idea, because you could imagine alien civilizations fighting it out with each other. What's one way that you could really cripple your enemy? Well, that would be to make a giant sunshade, send it to their planetary system, and put it between their home world and their star. With no light, their planet will just freeze over. So this may not have been what was going through Lucian's head when he wrote this, but that's a very powerful weapon to be used in interstellar conflicts. So that's pretty cool. But anyway, after the moon's thoroughly defeated, the light is taken away from them. They surrender, and they end up signing a treaty with the sun, where they pledge all of their loyalty to the sun and its forces, along with all of the moon's allies had to sign on to that as well. And this is kind of reminiscent of something, I guess, in modern science fiction, where you have all of these different groups coming together and making, I guess, a superpower in space. Don't you think, Andrew?
Yeah, I immediately thought of Star Trek's United Federation of Planets when I read this.
Yeah, it's again, there's so many things that are like brilliant for how long ago it was written. I feel this one, we're viewing this through modern eyes, but it's still quite cool, I think. But there's also one other thing that I find, or a few other things that are quite interesting. You want to take us through those points?
Yeah. So on the moon, the Moon King has a very interesting well, which has a large looking glass at the bottom. And if you go down to the bottom of this well, you can hear everything that's being said on Earth. So I guess this might have been inspired by people actually going into wells and hearing the acoustic effects of the echoing around the well walls. The other very interesting thing about this well is that by looking through this looking glass, they can actually see what is happening on the Earth in incredible detail. They can observe individual people moving around. And so this is very interesting because it seems to be way before any concept of a looking glass or a telescope that we were able to find. So we're not really sure how to interpret this. Maybe he was thinking of something like a magical crystal ball or something like that. The ancient Greeks did have glass, so maybe they observed the optical effects of light shining through the glass. But yeah, we're not really sure.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out neither of us are experts in ancient cultures, so we just had to scrounge around to try and find out some more information about this. But it really is interesting because, you know, he didn't need to say that there was a looking glass there, which was the thing that showed them stuff on the Earth. So it could just be our modern understanding of things getting in the way of what Lucian was actually intending. But, you know, it's actually a pretty cool concept and may actually end up happening. There's lots of projects that want to put telescopes on the moon because away from the Earth, you have much nicer conditions for certain types of astronomy, like radio astronomy. But after describing to us this potential first description of some kind of telescope, we then go on to talk about the strange things of the lunar customs. So when one of them is when a man grows old, he doesn't die, he just turns into a puff of smoke and air. And that air, if you squeeze it into a cup, it makes a kind of dew that you can drink. So I guess you're drinking your dead friends in that case, which is a bit strange. But on a more scientific point, it's pretty interesting that there's an idea that you could extract liquids from the air itself. So that's a pretty nice point.
Just to add to that, when they squeeze it through, they would be increasing the pressure of the gas, so that would tend to change it into a liquid.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly how much the Greeks understood about these kinds of things, but that's pretty cool for something that's like 2,000 years old. They have these people, along with their dying in puffs of smoke, had small beards. What? Small beards? What does that mean?
Beneath the knee. I think it's like just a
They had knee beards?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. These strange creatures had knee beards, it seems, and they had no nails on their feet, and their feet consisted of one great toe. So they would just, I guess, hop around on their giant toe. Their sweat. What? Their sweat with honey and milk makes excellent cheese.
Yeah.
I must have missed that point.
No, it's definitely there.
That's kind of...
They actually exercise themselves to make the sweat and then mix it with the honey and milk to make
That's
excellent
kind of gross. I don't think I'd be eating that cheese. Okay, what else? They got wine from grapes that drop large grape stones like hail when they're shaken by the wind. Okay, that's a nice little feature. And then our strange one-toed, hairy-knee aliens get even stranger. Their belly is empty, and it's a warm, hairy pouch that they can open and store things and children.
Yeah, when the children get cold, they
just chuck them in your stomach.
Creep into the belly pouch to get warmed up.
And I'm almost certain the Greeks didn't know about kangaroos.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of interesting. Maybe there are some other pouch creatures I can't recall. But how bizarre, you just throw things in your stomach. I guess it's handy. And rich people had no shame, and they wore clothes made of soft glass. So, yeah, this is a very fascinating society. This is much more alien. These moon people are much more alien than any of those other creatures that you were describing before, which is quite interesting. Poor people wore clothes of woven brass, and it's treated with what would be like, I guess, a more supple material, not as harsh as brass. You would think maybe that brass would be more expensive than glass, but who knows? But they get weirder still. They have eyes that can be removed and exchanged and preserved until the occasion arises. So I guess this could be a comment on maybe ancient medicine. People thought that if you didn't use your eyes as much, they might last longer. But it could also be like, today we could see this as maybe a form of early prosthetics. Just pop out your eye and chuck in someone else's if you're having eye troubles. And of course, as with every society, the rich people hoard eyes, so they could choose their desired eye from their great collection. Okay, what's this last one? Ears of tree or acorn. What does this one mean?
Yeah, that's what their ears are made out of.
Ears of tree or acorn. So they're... Man, this guy has a real fascination with acorns, doesn't he? First we have the wolves flying on flying acorns. Now they've got just ears made of acorns. All right, well, sure. Well, this is I guess we complained a bit before that the other creatures were a bit too common. They were just like Earth creatures, but blown up to larger scales. So he really pulled off all the stops here to give us a really bizarre picture of these moon beings. So anyway, that was all we heard about on the moon. They got into a big fight with the sun. They made peace eventually, and then our adventurers take off and head back toward the Earth. So where do they end up going on their return journey?
Yeah, so they first set off from the moon and make a stop at their new colony on Venus to take on some water. But they don't stay there long. They are close to the sun at this point, so they would like to go to the sun, but it's written in the story that the winds do not permit them to land on the sun. But they are close enough to get a good look at the sun, and they find it to be green, fertile, and well-watered, and abundant in everything necessary and agreeable. So
that's a classic ancient Greek literature phrase. Everything's agreeable.
Yeah.
But it does raise a question, though. Like, I wonder in this case, the sun obviously doesn't look like that to us. So I wonder if he is thinking that maybe if you got close enough to the sun, it just started looking nicer. Or he might have just been making a completely fabricated story, like he said at the beginning.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's no indication that it would be too hot on the sun to live.
Yeah.
Because I guess they knew that heat came from the sun. They felt it get warm in the daytime.
Yeah.
He knew that light comes from the sun to block the moon.
Yeah, there's some interesting disconnects, I guess, between logic.
So nonetheless, they continue their return voyage to Earth, and after traveling for a day and a night more, that's another interesting point. They travel for a night, but I guess they're always able to see the sun, so it's interesting how they're getting night times while they're in space.
Yeah.
Not like in close orbit around the Earth, but they continue traveling like this, and they find a city which is placed between the Pleiades and the Hyades star clusters. And in the city, they find that it's inhabited by sentient lamps. That is, lamps like with candles that emit light. And this lamp society is, I guess, quite hierarchical, with rich and poor. And rich lamps shine very brightly, while poor lamps are very dim. And they also have a kind of tyrannical king who sits in his throne room and just calls lamps by name. And if they do not come instantly to their summons, they are put to death by being extinguished.
Yeah, it's a fascinating idea. Again, he's doubling down and giving us some really strange life forms now, after we're criticizing the boringness of the other ones before. But this, I guess this is perhaps an early writing of, I guess, artificial life, or these aren't biological life forms, you would say. So some kind of non-biological life form that seems to like tyrants. So these are all of the major points that we found throughout the true story. And it's, I guess my general impression of this is, well, overall it's an ancient Greek tale, so it reads like one, so it's kind of hard to read through. But there are some really fascinating insights into how the ancient Greeks perceived things, like there being effectively no end to the atmosphere. Once you got into space, you could just sail around on some winds between planets and stars. And the idea is that you could just go to these other places and colonize them is also pretty amazing. So, you know, there's perhaps much more fiction in this story, leaning towards the fiction rather than the science side. But I think there's a lot of amazing insights for something that's effectively 2,000 years old. What are your thoughts on this story?
Yeah, I agree with those points. The other thing is, I guess he didn't really consider distances or orbits or anything like that we would think about naturally these days. Perhaps he was imagining something like just a plane in the sky that all of these things were aligned in. But yeah, it is, I agree, it is a very interesting work of science fiction, especially being so old that they're able to imagine these concepts like colonizing other planets and the moon being like a place that you can go to.
Yeah, and the truly bizarre nature of the moon people. So that was our thoughts on this story. Let us know what your thoughts are on this strange early science fiction story in the comments. I'll be interested to see how everyone else thinks about it. But for the next story, we're going to be going to what many have called the first science fiction. So people like Carl Sagan have called this story the Somnium, or The Dream, written by Johannes Kepler, as the first real science fiction story ever written. And I've had a sneak peek at it. It's perhaps leaning more towards the science side of the science fiction balance, but it should also be quite an interesting one. So we look forward to the next time when we talk about some really old science fiction and see what kind of insights we get from that and how the perception of the universe has changed over time. But for now, thank you very much for watching us ramble on about this very old and strange story.